Good morning, everybody. How many people actually went to the party last night? Wow. Well, thank you very much for actually waking up this morning. So I'm here to talk about typography on the web, and basically to take a look at where we were and where we are now, and what some of the issues that we're going to be running into. But I think one of the common questions is, what does typography do? Why do we even care about having the ability to use whatever fonts we want on the web? And I think it should hopefully be obvious that, when we look at certain type, like Helvetica Neue, that it evokes a certain feeling. Where something like Helvetica Neue tends to be used for fashion sites and designers because it creates a certain sense of modernism. Or we take a look at script fonts, and we see these for things that want to feel personalized, like wedding invitations and thank you notes. It evokes a certain emotion when we do this. Something like the Gotham font has a sense of history, but also a sense of modernism. The designer who designed this font actually went around New York looking at a lot of the typography within the city and used that inspiration for the stuff that he was doing when he was designing this font. So it probably comes as no surprise that, for Obama's campaign, that, to create that feeling of history and yet that forward-looking mentality, to use that type of typography within his design and within his campaign. So, it helps define style, feel, mood, and of course readability. When you look at a book that it's using a serif font, where the ascenders and descenders and the serifs help connect the words to make it easier to read. On screen, a lot of sans serif fonts, like Verdana, are designed specifically for readability on a computer monitor. And so these are very important things that we want to be able to do when we design a website. So let's take a look at some of the history. Way back when, what was the first thing that allowed us to actually customize fonts on the web? It was the font tag. Pretty straightforward. You specify a face, Arial, Verdana, whatever you had on your system. Problem is that the users had to have that on their system as well. It also wasn't very practical because every piece of text on your site needed to have a font tag wrapped around it. So then we had images. Okay, well, users needed the font on their system. That wasn't very practical. But we can do images. We have things like Photoshop and Fireworks that we can actually embed whatever font we want and embed it on the page. Okay, well, that's good. It allows us for any font to be used. But what about performance? I remember way back in the days of table-based designs having a navigation of like 7 items, but we wanted to have a nice aesthetic that matched the corporate branding. So we had 7 images, 1 for each item in the navigation. Hopefully that didn't change, because then you'd have to regenerate the images, reline everything up. But then you wanted rollovers, right? You wanted the nice little effect when you roll over. So you had the JavaScript, the on mouse over, on mouse out. Because, CSS hover techniques didn't exist. We didn't have image replacement. So let's say we had 7 items. We had 7 rollovers. That's 14 images that we had to download. That's 14 HTTP requests. And so that's a very cumbersome process. It's also cumbersome to maintain, as navigation items change. So it was really only practical for limited items with short text. You wouldn't do body text. A whole page is one big image. Of course, clients have asked for just that. You say, well, it's not very practical. It doesn't offer you any SEO benefits, or at least not very practical ones. But of course, some clients were like, oh, this has got to look amazing. This has really got to grab their attention, and Arial is just not going to do it. And of course, printing is less than ideal. You've got an image that's designed for the screen, 72 DPI or thereabouts. And when you go to print it, well, it looks all pixely, whereas the text is nicely rendered because it's vectorized, and printers are designed to handle text quite well. But images always look very pixelated. Or, if you had a nice stylized background and you had a logo that had the background artifact and you went to print it, well, you had this big square block with a nice logo with bits of the background that used to be on the page. And again, that wasn't very practical. Some of these issues People have kind of tried to work around these days with CSS and image replacement, but it's still less than ideal. And of course, you didn't have text selection. There was no way to actually select that text if you wanted to send a link to somebody and say, hey, check this out, and you just wanted to kind of copy and paste some text. Well, if it was an image, you didn't have that ability. So again, it's not very practical. And things like headings, right? If you had an entire site where every heading on the page should be nicely rendered, well, if you had, let's say, 1,000 pages on your site, rendering 1,000 images isn't very practical. Anytime you wanted to create new content, trying to create an image for a heading wouldn't be very practical. One of those solutions was server-side image generation, things like ImageMagick. There's one called Texturize, which it uses server-based image generation. Texturize is kind of interesting because it actually uses the Mac OS X rendering engine. So you can get subpixel aliasing, or anti-aliasing as the case is. So you get these really nice fonts. Problem is that it's Ruby-based and it's on Mac OS X. Not many people run that kind of configuration. So it's still not very practical. But if you wanted to check that out, it's texturize.org. So now we're kind of moving into present day. CSS, we have font stacks. We have the ability to get a little bit more flexibility. So the first one's probably pretty common. Arial, if they don't have Arial, then it defaults to Helvetica. If they don't have Helvetica, then it defaults to whatever sans serif font that they've defined on their system. And that's okay. But let's say I wanted to use Gotham on my website. Okay, well, I can specify it. And again, if the fallback, they don't have Gotham, is a sans serif font. Well, it's still kind of the same issue as using the font tag. That's not very practical if users don't have Gotham. I'll do a quick survey. How many people actually have Gotham installed on their system here? So we've got like 10 people. So 10 of you would get to see this. Everybody else doesn't. They're still stuck with whatever font that they have on their system. So as a designer who really wants a lot of control over their site, it's not really very practical. Hopefully you didn't do this as I did when I first got into CSS, applying class tags on every single paragraph. Anyway, so we had very common font stacks. These are ones that pretty much is what everybody used when it came to CSS. If you wanted a sans serif font, you were kind of torn between, well, maybe I'll use Arial, maybe I'll use Verdana, maybe I'll go all crazy and use Tahoma, and hoping that maybe 90% of your audience gets to see it. If you wanted a serif font, maybe you get to use something like Times New Roman or Georgia. And that was really all the flexibility that you had when it came to a font stack. Now, some people have tried to come up with complex font stacks, where they basically take a look at all the platforms and take a look at the popularity of certain things to try to create a more unique experience. So a lot of people have Microsoft Office installed, and as a result, they have the C fonts like Candera. So there's a greater likelihood that they're going to get that experience on their system. But even with a complex font stack, as a designer who's very meticulous, wants a certain line height, wants a certain spacing, if you don't want headings to break onto two lines, even complex font stacks can be very tricky because the compression of the font, how wide it is between one font and another, can change dramatically. The X height, which is essentially a measure of the height of the font, it can also differ. So you create completely different looks and feels depending on what fonts that you have. It can make designing very difficult, and you never necessarily know exactly what experience the user is getting, so you can just hope for the best. A couple resources that you can check out. I know these URLs are a little bit long. The slides will be available afterwards, so no worries. But they basically have tried to look at putting together actual font stacks that we can hopefully use. So what kind of alternatives do we have? I think people looked at this and went, well, it's not really very practical. And so we start seeing a lot of other technologies, things like Cipher, which uses a flash replacement technique. We have Kufon and Typeface, which tend to use Canvas or VML to create the look and feel that we want. But again, there's kind of pros and cons to these situations as well. So with Cipher, you need JavaScript and Flash installed in order for it to work. And what it does is it goes through and takes ordinary semantic content. So if you had headers, your H1s, your H2s, and you basically tell the JavaScript and you say, okay, find all these headings and replace it with a Flash movie. The Flash movie has the font embedded and can dynamically take the text that was there and change it into a Flash movie of your heading. But again, that's not very practical. One, it's slow for a lot of elements. If you had a page with 15 headings, very long content, or maybe sidebar content. That's 15 Flash movies that you have to embed on the page. That starts to slow down scrolling. It slows down loading time, having to load and instantiate 15 Flash movies. That's just not very practical. And really, you still can only use it for headlines. It wasn't really practical for linked text. It wasn't practical for body text. So it didn't really give us a whole lot of extra benefits over what was there before. And it can be really difficult to tweak because, again, the font metrics, the compression and the X height differed between whatever you had defined in the CSS and whatever you had defined in the Flash movie. So you're often tweaking things just to create a consistent look and feel that didn't get clipped within the Flash movie. And it wasn't very practical. It was a tedious effort to have to go through. And of course, support for CSS features was limited. To be able to define a hover style or a link style or text transform or font weight just wasn't very practical in using a technique like Cipher. So Kufon came around and said, well, yeah, you're right. Flash is kind of cumbersome, but with a lot of browsers having Canvas support, maybe we can do that. And IE has VML support, so maybe we can use that in there. So what it actually does is it generates an SVG font or VML outlines for the actual font. It actually defines it in a JavaScript format. So you still need JavaScript, and it, similar to Cipher, will go through your page. Anything you've defined as needing to be transformed will replace that text with a canvas or VML element with the font information. But you still didn't have text selection. You still had the same kind of limitations as images, where you can't actually select the text. And while performance was better, that you could probably use it for body text, losing all those other features, like being able to right-click on a link and say open in a new window, losing those kind of features affect the user experience. And again, wasn't very practical. And then the original text was basically hidden away from the screen so that you didn't see that in combination with the canvas element. One of the benefits, though, over something like Cipher was the fact that it did support some CSS styling. The fact that you could actually use text transform or font weight, and it would actually look at your CSS and understand how to style that stuff up within the browser. So it was not bad. We were getting better at kind of mimicking exactly what we wanted. We wanted that custom typography that we want on the web. So there's another one kind of came out shortly thereafter called Typeface, very similar to Kufon in that it uses Canvas or VML to do the replacement. But they tried to enhance it a little bit better, include things like letter spacing and font stretch to be able to give you a little bit more flexibility at the CSS level. But again, it didn't support everything, and a lot of the new CSS features that were coming in would basically have to be built into the engine in order to have access to those features. Of course, all this said and done, what's the biggest hurdle is licensing. Licensing is troublesome for font foundries because they don't want people to just be able to throw a font on the web and have people to do whatever they want. So you think of a Flash file. Flash file has the font metrics stored within it so that it can render the font dynamically. Okay, well, that's great, but then anybody could grab that Flash movie, embed it on their site, and have a custom font and never had to have paid for the font. Now, most licenses, if you take a look at foundries, aren't very clear. You should probably contact the foundry before you use any of these techniques and say, do you support this? Because many fonts don't allow embedding in this fashion. The Gotham example that I showed earlier, so Gotham is put together by a foundry called Hofler and Frere Jones. Their licensing explicitly says you are not allowed to embed this in a Flash movie as dynamic text. You're not allowed to use techniques like Kufon because those font metrics are stored on the server, available to anybody to use, and they're not allowed. Okay, so if we can't use the font, then we're still kind of stuck in the same situation. We've got a limited number of fonts that we can use. What kind of options do we have? And this is where we kind of stand today. So @FontFace is a CSS feature that's actually been around for a number of years. Microsoft was actually the first or one of the first companies to actually support the @FontFace declaration. And this allows us to do some pretty cool things. The text here in the navigation, in the body text, This is an actual website that uses ant font face embedding to create the look and feel that people want. The nice, crisp design, well-rendered text that aren't images. We don't have to export rollovers for the navigation or for the headings. And so we can create a much more unique experience and one that really can speak to an audience and maintain the style, the mood, and the readability that we want with our sites. So this is my site that I actually had done a lot of research trying to do font embedding. I used open source fonts in this case in order to get the look and feel that I want. There are thankfully some agencies out there that are really trying to make the web better by creating fonts that look good for the web. So the headings uses one called League Gothic, and then the navigation up at the top uses one called Musée Sans. And the cool thing is it works on Opera Mobile. It works on the iPhone using a number of different techniques, which is what I'll explain now. So with @font face, it's dynamic. We have what CSS allows us to do. Instead of having to use Arial or Verdana, Georgia, these basic fonts that are on 99.9% of the sites out there, because that's all we've really had available to us, that we can specify whatever font we want. And we put that font information on the server, and we can link to it. That font gets downloaded to the user's browser, and it gives us the full capabilities as if that font was actually natively installed on the user's machine. So that gives us the full extent of CSS. Anything you can do with CSS, like text transform, font weight, font stretch, line height, any of that will work exactly the same. The fact that we can do text selection, the fact that when we right-click on a link, we have access to all the browser features that we expect. These are good things. These are the kind of experience that we want. Fact is that we can get it to work on mobile platforms. It's fantastic. Again, that's not necessarily something that you can do with techniques like Flash replacement. We don't have Flash on the iPhone. That's not something that we can do. And actually, I just mentioned the last one, print quality. So if we're doing these techniques where we're trying to replace with an image, well, it doesn't look as nice. How do we handle the fact that the background image isn't going to be there? With @font face, we can have an equal print quality. The font that we had specified on the web can actually be used in the print. And I think those are fantastic reasons for wanting to do it. So what kind of different font formats that we have? It turns out there's actually a whole slew of them. So TrueType and OpenType, I think, are the most common font file formats that people have installed on their machine. And if you wanted to use this and actually link to a TrueType file or an OpenType file on your system, the fact that it works in Firefox, Safari, Opera, including Opera Mobile, Chrome 4, is great. We've already achieved an almost ubiquitous situation. Then we have EOT. So this is the way that Microsoft had implemented it way back when. And the reason for this is because foundries were very leery of people just embedding a font on their system. Wow, that TrueType, the TTF file is sitting on somebody's server. Well, I can just download it, install it, and use it without ever having to pay for it. Well, foundries don't really like that. So Microsoft was very sympathetic and said, okay, well, we've developed this format that basically locks the font format, compresses it, and provides a lot of benefits to font founders, and did a lot of features that made sure that performance wasn't going to be an issue or as much of an issue when trying to embed a type on the web. So supported in IE4 and up, still in IE8, should be in IE9. So this is fantastic. So now we've got two formats that basically hits 99% of the market. How do we generate an EOT file? There's two ways. One is a program called Weft that Microsoft came out with. So I say complete and utter garbage. By that I mean it doesn't work. Like you try to generate, it'll lock up. I mean, it was built and designed 10 years ago, and they've never updated it. Thankfully, there's a lot of other resources out there. There's a command line tool called TTF to EOT that can run. Very simple. And there's a lot of web services actually that will allow you to just go to the website, upload a font, it'll generate the EOT file so you can actually embed this on your system. So how do you go from OTF or to TTF to EOT? Because unfortunately most of the conversions, as you saw with either WEFT or the TTF to EOT command line app, require TTF, not OTF. So you kind of have to go from OpenType to TrueType to the embeddable OpenType in order to get the fonts that we want. There's an open source application called FontForge that I believe is cross-platform, will work on Windows, will also work on the Mac, probably Linux as well. Not the most elegant application, but it's free. And you can actually use it to create a TrueType font from an OpenType font. The problem is that the font names aren't transferred properly and must be set manually. So there's an article that I had written with a screencast, so you can check that out. And with a little bit of work, you can actually generate the proper TrueType file that you can actually go through the embedded OpenType conversion. So there's another format, SVG fonts. So I mentioned Kufon, for example, will actually convert a font into an SVG format that it uses to actually do the rendering within Canvas. And so, okay, what kind of support do we have? Chrome 0.3 actually supported that natively. So you didn't have to do any kind of command line flags to enable TrueType embedding. And it works on the iPhone as well. So now we're kind of in the situation where, yes, we're now have stuff that works on mobile platforms. We have stuff that works in pretty much every desktop platform. Fantastic. There's some bugs, unfortunately, which we always kind of run into with these things. Font embedding, despite the fact that the concept has been around for years, a lot of browsers are only getting into implementing it within the last couple of years. And web developers have only been using it for the last 6 months to a year. And so we're starting to see these edge cases where, okay, well, what happens when I try to use a certain technique? So if I use an SVG font, oh, it was great if I had it open up in the tab, but if I duplicated that tab and I looked at it in the second tab, the font wouldn't be there on the second page. It would default back to whatever the fallback font was. So these are really kind of bizarre things that we can start to run into. And things like text selection for SVG fonts, for whatever reason, didn't work as consistently as it should have. So how do we create an SVG font? Again, FontForge allowed you to export into an SVG format. And there's a command line tool. It's Java-based called Batik. Problem is it kind of tries to throw in a bunch of stuff which the SVG font format doesn't support. So you kind of have to go through and clean up empty nodes and stuff like that. And oddly enough, once you do that, even though you kind of lose a lot of the font hinting and kerning, which is information that basically tells the font how to handle certain situations, even though you kind of lose that information, the size of an SVG font turns out to be about the same as a TrueType or OpenType font, thankfully. And now we have another format. Okay, so web foundries don't really like font embedding because they don't want their fonts out there. EOT kind of solved that problem, but that was only for IE. And the compression that EOT used had patents on it, and so none of the other browsers wanted to touch it. We don't want to do EOT embedding because of the fact that this kind of issues exist. Microsoft was nice a couple years ago, said, okay, fine, we'll throw the EOT standard, we'll document it all, and we'll try to make it a W3C spec. What about the compression? Well, the compression actually the patent wasn't owned by Microsoft, it was owned by another company. And they said, okay, if you want to put it in as a W3 spec, we will make the patent royalty free and there won't be any issues in doing that. But when the other browser developers started implementing it, they started running into some other hurdles. And so as a result, there had been just some discussion with font foundries, and they actually came up with a new format called WOF. WOF, I suppose, if you wanted to call it that. So it's a web open font format that the font foundries were actually standing behind, which is fantastic. Here's a format that they like and will allow you to use. Works in Firefox 3.6, which is great. IE9, I tried to corner some of the IE9 guys last night, Dean, and I was like, okay, is WAF support going to be in IE9? Unfortunately, they weren't able to give me a definitive answer, so maybe. They're interested in looking at it. Hopefully, by the time IE9 final comes out, we'll have support. And the fact that the font foundries are behind it is encouraging. So how do we actually create a WAF file? And unfortunately, there's not too many resources out there right now. There is a command line tool made by one of the folks behind at Mozilla. Works on Mac or Windows and allows you to actually generate the WAF file. Okay, so we have EOT, true type or open type. We've got SVG. We've got WAF. That's a lot of formats. Very cumbersome process to actually embed these fonts on a system. And so, okay, how do we actually do this at the CSS? So we have at font face. Unfortunately, the text is a little bit clipped here. There's an at symbol before that font face. So we have to just specify the font family. So in this case, Museo Sans was the one I used for my headings. You can give it whatever name you want. I like to give it something unique and identifiable. And this is going to be the font family that you would use throughout your CSS. Anytime you specified a font family, this is the name that you're going to give it. So we need to specify the EOT file format that we've generated, specify the source, and give it a URL. Okay, so what about the other browsers? Well, we might want to specify a local version. What if the user already has the font installed on their system? So we specify the PostScript name for those systems. Problem is some browsers use the PostScript name. Others use what they call the font name. So you have two ways of specifying the font information for a locally installed font. Then we have the WAF format. We have the true type format. So yeah, it's getting a little cumbersome. Thankfully, we only have to define this once in our CSS. We don't have to define this multiple times. And of course, we have the SVG format. So that's a lot of information. And to generate all these files from a single font format isn't very practical. So there's a great resource called Font Squirrel that I really like. One-step conversion process. You specify a font, just upload the font, and it will automatically take the true type or open type font file format, and it will automatically generate the EOT, the SVG, and the WAF file formats. It'll actually also, he just did an update about a week ago that will automatically generate a Kufon fallback. So if they don't actually have any of these features, it'll fall back to use Kufon as an alternate format. It actually creates example HTML and CSS, so you can just copy and paste that into your project. It also does examples with data URIs. So data URIs can actually offer us some performance gains, so it doesn't have to do another HTTP request, and can actually solve, which I'll get to in a little bit. There's a performance issue called, it's kind of dubbed the flash of unstyled content or the flash of unstyled text, where in some browsers you'll actually see the text in a default font, whatever the fallback font that was specified that the user has on their system, until the font actually gets downloaded to the user's system, and then it would re-render the page using that new font. And so data URIs can actually get around that, and that's, again, one of the things that the font scroll generator can get around. Kufon fallback, as I mentioned, and it does subsetting, which I'll get to in a little bit. So these are all really great. One-step process is fantastic. I've got the URL for that at the end of the slides, which I'll link up. Okay, so performance. Now that we've got our CSS, we've got all our font file formats, what are the kind of the performance issues that we have to worry about when actually doing ant font face embedding on our system? Subsetting is one of those techniques. So you think of all the different fonts that, or all the different text that you might have on your page. How much do you need? So take something like Arial Unicode. It has hundreds, if not thousands, of glyphs within a font format. Well, if you're only using a Latin character set, as most English-speaking countries do, well, we don't need all that information. So if a font file being megabytes in size, it's just going to be impractical. You don't want to be sitting there for a couple minutes while a font file actually downloads. So Arial Unicode because of the fact that it has so many languages embedded within it, it's great if the font's already on the system, which thankfully this font is on 95% of systems. But that's 23 megs. Can you imagine actually trying to link to a 23 meg file just for a font on your system? Not very practical. So the subsetting basically says, okay, get rid of all the glyphs that I don't need and only keep the set that I need for my website. The WEFT tool that Microsoft had put together actually had support for subsetting. So you would actually tell it to specify your website. It would actually go through your website, take all the characters that you had on the website, and generated a font file that was unique to that, which was fantastic because then we had this subsetted font for performance, very important. But I think Arial Unicode is probably the exception. Most font files can still range in the 100K, 200K range because they have so much information. And that's still a lot of information. I mean, that's more usually than most pages, including all images and CSS and HTML. So that's not very practical. So subsetting reduces the number of glyphs in a file, which is great for Latin languages. If we've only got 26 letters, lowercase, uppercase, numbers, punctuation, we can get away with a fairly small file. Asian languages, unfortunately, when you've got 10,000 characters in a language, not so practical. So going back to my example, so the Museo Sans that I only used for the heading, the tips, tricks, and bookmarks title and the navigation, I'm only using uppercase letters, except for like the letters O and N. So I'm only using uppercase, so I can get rid of all the lowercase. I barely have any punctuation, so I can get rid of all the other excessive punctuation that I have. And I ended up with about 40 characters. So compressing this font, I was actually able to get it down to 8K. So 8K is great in any of the formats that I had, which is basically the size of a normal image. So those are the kind of optimizations we can make. The Museo Sans font, normally I think it was around 30 to 40K. To be able to compress that information down to 8K is very useful. Of course, there's always exceptions and issues that we start to run into. So I got rid of all the lowercase glyphs in my font at first until I noticed a really weird thing when I was actually using text transform uppercase. In that IE and Opera actually take a look at the fact that my text in the HTML was lowercase, and then, oh, well, you don't have that lowercase character in the font, so I'm going to switch to a fallback font. And then it looked at the text transform uppercase and went to the uppercase. Okay, not very practical. So I still had to have the lowercase glyphs in my font file, even though they would never be used, because IE and Opera got a little confused. Other techniques that we can look at is compression. Just like we use gzip compression to send CSS and JavaScript and HTML over the wire, we should be looking at doing the same thing with that. EOT and WAF, thankfully, have built-in compression support built in, so we don't have to worry about those kind of issues. WEFT compresses by default. The TTF to EOT doesn't. And it doesn't because it doesn't have access to the compression patents that are part of the EOT format. So then in which case we should be using the gzip compression when those fonts aren't actually compressed. So that'll apply if you're doing SVG, TTF, OTF, or uncompressed EOT. So as I mentioned before, flash of unstyled text. This is kind of a catch-22. How do you handle a situation where you have to wait for the file to download? There's basically two thoughts to this. So Firefox and Opera will actually show unstyled text until the font's downloaded. And a gentleman by the name of Paul Irish, who basically came up with that bulletproof font face syntax, gave it this fout name, which oddly enough, fout in Dutch means mistake. So it's kind of appropriate. And in IE, it has a bit of an issue where if you have a script tag before the @fontface declaration, it actually blocks downloading of any other resources until it's actually downloaded the font file. Otherwise, again, like Firefox and Opera, it'll show unstyled text until the font's downloaded, and then it'll re-render the page. Okay, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is to do something like Chrome and Safari, where it shows no text at all until the font is downloaded. So if you think, well, how long is it? One of the things I was doing when I was testing, for example, the mobile platform, I had mislinked the file, so it was trying to download it. But it would take like 30 seconds for it to time out. So I'd actually sit there for 30 seconds, and I couldn't see any of my headings. Nothing showed up. And then finally, after that, it suddenly switched, and my text actually rendered. So these are kind of those issues, because you don't want, imagine a whole text, body text, paragraphs of content that have completely nothing, completely blank screen until the font is downloaded. So it's kind of one of those catch-22. How do you handle those kind of situations? Now, you can kind of get around this by using data URIs. So data URIs work in IE8. They work in Safari, Chrome, Firefox. And what the data URI does is it basically takes that font information and actually embeds it right in the CSS file. So this way, you don't have to wait for a secondary request. Once it's downloaded the CSS, it already has all your font information, and it pretty much eliminates that flash of unstyled text, and it eliminates those delays in Safari and Chrome. And Opera 10.10 still has a bit of a bug, so kind of those weird issues. Thankfully, 10.50, which is out for Windows now, solves that problem. But the biggest hurdle is still licensing. Most foundries still haven't really solved a lot of these issues. They haven't really been up to date on how to handle these kind of things. People can still do TrueType and OTF embedding. We're not really sure about that. That's not what we want. So most fonts, even free fonts, and it's something that you have to really look into, like the Musée Sans, even though it's free, it's kind of like a shareware thing. He's like, okay, you can use the font, you can embed it in your site, but the only thing that I ask is that you link back to me. Okay, simple enough. I can do that. But a lot of other fonts are like, hey, you want to use it? You can use it for your print projects. You can use it for your web projects as long as it's embedded in an image, but don't link the actual file on your website. Because they're really more concerned about distribution. They want to know where people are getting their font format, their font files. And so they'll say, okay, well, even though you can use my font free of charge, you just can't distribute it. And so don't allow font-face embedding. Some foundries are starting to look at WAF or EOT support. Again, I mentioned Hofler and Frere-Jones earlier, the company that makes Gotham. And they've been very much sort of on the leading edge. Font Shop is another one. Typotech. There's a lot of agencies that have been trying to be proactive and do allow EOT and WAF embedding, even though they don't support the other ones. But most importantly, contact them for more information. That can be a kind of annoying situation if they never get back to you. So how do we solve these problems? There's been, within the last year, a number of services starting to pop up. A lot of them in beta, some of them starting to actually roll out of beta into actual production, like Typekit, Typotech, which is a font foundry that I mentioned, Kernest, FontDeck, and FontSpring. These are all a number of different companies that basically will do all this stuff, the font generation, all the different font formats, and they basically act as a CDN, as a content delivery network for you. The fonts sit on their servers, and then you simply link either to a CSS or to a JavaScript file that you have embedded on your site, and it will automatically embed the information that's necessary to create the optimal performance on your site. However, there's some disadvantages. I mean, for example, me, I tend to be the kind of guy that likes to own everything, and I feel a little bit uncomfortable having something on another person's server, because if their server goes down, then I'm going to be sitting there like, okay, I have to wait, for example, in Safari and Chrome for that font to error out before my users get to see that content. At least if it's on my server and my server goes down, they're not getting anything. So, some of the services require JavaScript. One of the advantages of that font-face embedding is the fact that if people don't have JavaScript, it just works. But some of these services actually require JavaScript because it tries to do some obfuscation in order to actually download the fonts on your system. So again, if a user has JavaScript turned off, well, then you're going back to the fallback font in those situations. None of the services serve SVG. So that means older versions of Chrome or the iPhone, they're not going to get these fonts. So you're still kind of sitting in a situation where you're not getting as wide of an acceptance as you normally would, kind of doing a homegrown solution. And of course, services try to obfuscate to prevent the ability to actually install the fonts permanently. As a result of that, a lot of these services don't have caching because they don't want this font information that has been downloaded to be locally stored and for you to be able to inspect that information. So, okay, you're not caching the information, so you have to request that information every time. It's not a very practical experience when you're looking at performance. So some of the resources that I had linked up before, FontForge, Batik, and the Font Squirrel generator. I can't recommend the generator highly enough. Him and a few other folks actually created the service FontSpring, which was another one that I had mentioned, which, a lot of the stuff that he's doing in generator is really taking a look at, what kind of issues are we running into. Because this font-face embedding is so new, I think, to web developers, that we're starting to see the edge cases, and we're starting to see some of the effects of that the fact that every font actually isn't practical to use in this kind of technique. So for example, Boing Boing, they actually had an article a few months ago because they tried to use @font-face embedding on their site. Problem is that the font that they were using didn't really have the proper hinting. So it looked great on the Mac. It looked great on Windows with ClearType. But a lot of users have ClearType turned off. It makes the text look fuzzy. I don't like that. But without ClearType, this particular font didn't have the right hinting information, and it looked awful. It looked blocky. It looked chunky. And a lot of users actually complained that it wasn't an ideal experience. And so Boing Boing got rid of it. So what a lot of people are starting to do now is they're actually starting to look at creating an optimized experience. So FontShop, for example. FontShop has actually been going through and creating optimized fonts. So a font at a small point size still looks good whether or not it's using ClearType or using the native OS X rendering or the Firefox rendering engine or without ClearType or any kind of anti-aliasing at all. So thankfully, a lot of foundries are starting to jump on board, but we're starting to see that a larger disparity between really good fonts and really bad fonts. We're starting to see a lot more value if you are trying to create that aesthetic and that, trying to create the style and the mood that we want in our sites, that we're starting to see a lot of value in actually paying for a font. It was funny. I remember a friend of mine had come over and it's like, "Can you help me, do my wedding invitations?" "Oh, okay, no problem." And taking a look at the fonts that I had actually on my system, it's like, "Well, is there any other fonts that we can use?" I said, "Okay, well, we can hop out to this site and we'll take a look at some of the fonts there." And I was like, "So this one, it's $30. $30 for a font? Why can't I just download it? It should be free." So I think we're, thankfully, as web designers and web developers, can see a lot more value in the effort that foundries have to put in to actually generate a font that works well cross-platform. And like I said, with the generator, a lot of the work they've been doing is just trying to make sure that the fonts, even the free fonts that they generate, look good. So it's fantastic. So where to get fonts? So a lot of those services that I had linked up, so Font Squirrel. So there's the generator, but there's also the actual website where they've actually generated pre-bundled kits that you can actually download and use on your site right away, that you don't actually have to go through the generation process. Typekit, Typothec. So Typekit basically acts as a service for a number of other companies, a number of foundries, and will serve up the files for those particular foundries. Typothec is their own foundry, so they have their own service for their own fonts, which is kind of cool. FontSpring, made by the same guy that did Font Squirrel, and then Kernest is another service very similar to Typekit. So I have reached the conclusion. So any questions? And please, we have mics on either side if you have any questions.
Where will
So the slides will be available. My site, snook.ca, as well as SlideShare. I'll have them posted before the end of today. Snook.ca, SNOOK.ca.
So with most comps I receive, the text usually has like Photoshop's anti-aliasing on the text in there. So what kind of options are there for using embedded fonts to replicate that?
When it comes to actually handling the Photoshop rendering, Flash actually gives us a lot more control to say how that text should be rendered. Unfortunately, with at-font face embedding, we're kind of at the mercy of the browser, the system, the operating system that they happen to be on, as well as whatever features that the user has enabled. So Firefox actually has their own rendering system, although I've heard rumors that they're actually going to switch over to, for example, on the Mac, they're going to use the Mac rendering engine for text. Safari, of course, uses the internal one. Chrome uses the internal one. So you're kind of victim to that, so you can't like tweak it and say, well, make it a little bit more bolder or a little more crisp like you can in Photoshop. And I think that's something that designers have often had to come to grips with. You know, they have these great comps where they've managed to tweak a lot of these things, and then a lot of clients will be like, that's what I want, that's the way it should look. But when they actually load it up in their browser, they don't get that fantastic experience. And on Windows, it really does depend. Do they have ClearType installed or enabled? If not, then they're not going to get that lovely anti-aliasing experience. And IE9, for example, have worked to improve on the rendering experience of type. But we are, unfortunately, victim to whatever the browser allows us to do. However it renders it is what we have available to us. Any other questions?
Do you think we'll ever get to see the sort of big name commercial fonts this way?
Absolutely. So there are a lot of foundries that are starting to get behind this. Adobe, unfortunately, has been pretty mute. I mean, Adobe has a huge folio of fonts there, but we have a number of companies. Unfortunately, most of the names escape me. I know I've mentioned Font Shop. I've mentioned Hofler and Frere Jones. There are a lot of agencies that are starting to understand that, you know, they want their stuff to be used and purchased. I mean, they want to sell fonts, right? That's the whole point of it. And so they're recognizing that this is an avenue that they have available to them. One of the problems that we're starting to run into is, at least I feel it's a problem, is that you're kind of limited to, okay, well, this font foundry only offers their fonts through a service like Typekit. So you have to go to Typekit in order to use their fonts on the web, as opposed to saying, well, you know what, I don't want to use their CDN service. I want to be able to self-host. And so these are still sort of some of the problems that we have to look at and address. And I think with EOT and WAF, hopefully, you know, like maybe 5 years down the road, those will be ubiquitous, and we'll be at a point where, yes, you know, we no longer have to worry about using third-party services, and font foundries will be on board and provide their fonts in that format, so that when you buy the font, not only do you get the OTF format, but you also get the WAF format, so you can quickly embed it on your site. You know, I think it's one more facet of development that is going to be something that web designers and developers are going to have to be concerned with. And just all the issues that I talked about, performance and subsetting and all those kinds of things. But you know, I think we're seeing a huge transition, and thankfully there's a lot of good stuff coming down the pipe.
So I have a question and a comment. The question is, with all the free font resources, I understand the value of all the hard work that goes into making a font, you know, the business model behind font founders, but with all the free fonts available and the sort of the crowdsourcing technique of people maybe playing with the hinting for theirs and feeding that back into the community, don't you think that's also a sort of a critical aspect of this? The fact that that the whole movement has produced a lot of these free fonts that are, some of which are very good. And so that's my question: is how important do you think that is, or do you not think it's important? And my comment is that W3C has recently they're trying to start a fonts working group, and they've tried this for a while. There was a lot of pushback, but I think that as of just a few days ago, it looks like there is going to be a fonts group formed that's going to be standardizing WAF. So
that's very cool. The question is how much value should we be putting into free fonts? There's so the League Gothic font that I had showed that I had been using on my site is by a group of people. They formed an organization called the League of Movable Type. So the League of Movable Type is trying to act as an open source resource for typography, and to have a venue where people who are passionate about typography to create a font that is suitable not only for print but also for web design, where they have that attention to detail and are trying to expand and include glyphs not only for Latin character sets but other languages and other character sets, and people that are really trying to make sure that we have access to quality fonts, that we don't necessarily have to pay sometimes hundreds of dollars to get full font sets where you've got $30 for the regular font, $30 for the bold, italic. By the time you've got the 10 fonts in a particular set, you've spent $300 to $500. There are people that are dedicated to that cause. Going to the question of how important is it, I think in our marketplace there's always value in both. There's going to be value in commercial, and there's going to be value in the open source, just like there is on the web, just like there is in the desktop. I think there are people that are passionate about open source, and people who are willing to put the effort into making sure that we have that kind of quality on the web.
Hey, you talked about subsetting, and I might have missed it, but did you mention, are there tools to help you subset, or were you just going through and somehow manually?
So that's a very good question. You're right, I didn't actually mention that. So for the stuff that I did on my site, I actually used a tool called FontForge, which I did mention. FontForge, it's basically a font editing tool. So you could actually go in and modify if you thought, well, I really like this font, but I really want to just tweak it a little bit. You could actually modify the metrics and create your own font if you wanted to. But in there as well, you can select a glyph and just delete it, which is what I ended up doing. I ended up going through and said, okay, well, for Musée Sans that I'm using on my website, I only need those 40 characters, so let me go through and delete everything else. And then just simply re-export that file as an OTF or TTF or SVG. So FontForge is a great application for doing that. It's not the most elegant program. It looks awful. It doesn't behave like a native application, but it works. But it's also the other reason why I like Generator, the Font Squirrel Generator, because it will allow you to do subsetting. And it's really, I think you did a great job at it, in that you can actually say, okay, well, I only want punctuation and Latin character set. These are like options within the subsetting on the website. Or you can actually specify Unicode ranges. So you can say, well, I need Unicode range from, I can't remember Unicode numbers off the top of my head, 30 to 55, if that's what I wanted, that I could access those, and I could specify just those particular fonts, and the Font Squirrel Generator will automatically subset the font that you've uploaded. So those are the two avenues that you generally have available to you.
With embedding the fonts, do you know how the caching is handled? Is it per site, or is it kind of per font, or per the location where the font is? And the reason I ask is because with a lot of JavaScript libraries out there, there's CDNs where you can go and pull them from, and maybe it's already cached on the user's machine. And could you do something like that for like some standard subsets of fonts?
Absolutely. So The caching, so I mentioned a little bit with a lot of the font embedding services where they don't support caching or have very short-lived, like 5-10 minutes for caching. But if you've created the font file yourself and you want to self-host, you could absolutely put that on a CDN of your own. If you had a free font and you wanted to provide a CDN and offer that up to other people to embed on their site, absolutely. And that you can create some far future expiry date. So by all means, that stuff should have the same kind of caching that you would probably do with JavaScript and CSS to make sure that when people go from page to page or come back to the site, or if you can create shared resources that multiple sites can use, then we can create those kind of optimized experiences for more users. So absolutely.
Thanks.
So you said you can cover about 99% of all browsers with just 2 formats. So why should you bother with SVG or WAP or any of that?
It depends on how meticulous you want to be. I tend to be I tend to be quite meticulous, and that, I want people to get the best experience they can, regardless of the format that they're in. And I think because there are tools out there, like the font scroll generator, that make it so easy to do it. It's like, it takes you 2 seconds to upload a file. Why not do it? But yeah, it's always that, where's your cutoff line for support? And if you've got 2 file formats that do work in 99%, that's great. Only problem is that 99% was EOT and TrueType and OpenType. Font licensing, most don't support TrueType or OpenType, but may offer EOT embedding. So then you're looking at EOT and WAF support, so you're only getting Firefox 3.6 and IE, which is still quite a market share, but nowhere near 90%, where you're looking at maybe 70 to 80%, not quite as good as if you could do all these other formats. And that's, again, where some of these services come in, where if you're doing something like Typekit or Kernest or FontDeck, that at least those services do support the TrueType embedding. In anything that you do, like using Flash or Silverlight on your website, when you make that decision to implement that technology on your website, you're always weighing the pros and cons. So, what is the Silverlight penetration? What's the Flash penetration? Is it worthwhile to go down that route? And for some people, the answer is going to be yes. For some people, that answer is going to be no. For me, certainly with my own site, I was just curious what I could pull off. And the fact that I could pull off 99.9 by using SVG and WAF and all these other formats was beneficial. And that's something that I wanted to do to be able to maintain that experience. But for your site, maybe that's not the case. Maybe you'll say, okay, I don't want to spend that extra time to maintain and worry about those file formats. Well, thank you very much, everybody. It was a pleasure.